Good afternoon, everyone. Today I have with me Daniel Nigro. You know him as smAsho Mash. We're looking
Thanks for
for
having me.
information about the grand solar minimum. And what I found so fascinating about his channel was the description of the solar wind, because these changes that we're seeing with our sun as it goes into a lower activity state, that solar wind is a complete component of what's happening. Rolf Witche talks about it. David Lapointe talks about it. Daniel talks about it. So explaining some solar wind, no solar wind, it's very apparent as it goes through the daily space weather. So Daniel, thank you for joining me today. We had so much to talk about in the pre-discussion and writing back and forth over these last months. So good to have you on the show, and hopefully we can boil it down and some more easy to understand terms of what's happening in the way the sun's changing and the way that affects our Earth's climate, and then kind of what we can look forward to moving out into 2025, 2024, something like this. The floor is yours. Thanks, Dan.
Yeah, thanks very much for having me. I'm glad to hear that you're interested in the videos. You're perhaps learning something about the sun you didn't know, and the most importantly, letting people know what the data means, how things relate to each other. It's very complicated. You show somebody a magnetosphere movie, and they go, "What is that?" And you tell them it's the Earth, and they go, "I had no idea that was going on." They don't necessarily know how that stuff relates to things like their weather. I mean, I've had comments on people who have weather channels and said, "Hey, check out my space weather video." And they're like, "The sun has nothing to do with weather." So
But it does.
it can be a tough slog, the IPCC 5 data versus the IPCC 6 data is going to be totally insane because there's practically no solar forcing variables. And I know Ben Davidson's got a good list. There's about 15 known solar forcing variables that aren't in the current climate models. So that's an issue. Now, regarding what solar cycle 25 will be like, that's a tough one. There's a lot of different analyses of this, and there's a lot of different cycles that are overlapping at the same time. So it's very tough to say. You got to look at things like magnetic seismology, and it's not just the counting of the sunspots that figures into it. So there's a whole lot going on at the same time. And I started studying the sun about 2003. That was when I kind of discovered things like coronal mass ejections and coronal holes and stuff. And even back then, actually, a lot of solar forecasters were predicting a grand solar minimum back then. So it's tough to call. And actually, we're in a rising state of the north polar field right now on the sun. So this is kind of crunch time in a lot of ways as we look at those magnetic fields and try to figure out what's going to happen next.
Yeah, that's true. There's so much variability from NASA to independent researchers and forecasters out there.
Exactly.
John Casey is saying 50 sunspots or less, yet NASA is putting it up there around 100. So, that's almost double from one of the experts on the planet. So where do we go? The amount of solar activity that we get out of this one is going to determine truly how much food we can grow on the planet moving forward. And that's
correct.
The reason I do my channel, and then we overlap here because the sun does control all these changes that you're seeing on the planet happening at the moment. It's just a longer term cycle, but there's many that are saying perhaps it's a heavier, more powerful cycle intertwined and going to override this 400-year cycle. But it is all about the cycles that are intertwining, and it moves through history again and again and again. I think that's why the ancients were so focused on the repeating cycles of the heavens and the constellations, because there we go, and here it comes again.
Exactly. And, determining how the solar polar fields are derived is kind of a mystery. I mean, if you take a geology class, they're going to tell you that the Earth's magnetic field is generated by a molten sea of liquid nickel and iron underneath the surface. And ultimately, you don't need that stuff to have the magnetic field that we have. All you need is a magnet moving through a magnetic field. And when you take into consideration that all you have to be doing is moving on a magnet through the sun's magnetic field to have a magnetic field via the Hall effect, you're going to realize that the sun could be doing the same thing. So perhaps there's no way to even tell by looking at anything within our solar system what the sun is going to do next. There's a thing called the local chimney, which is kind of the plasma filament, plasma tube, or you could say magnetic filament, or you could say electric current line that the sun seems to be moving on around the galactic center. It's very difficult to be able to tell what's going on with that, because when you look at a magnetic field in space, if there's a magnetic field behind it, you will not be able to see it, or it will at least look distorted, because magnetic fields obscure other magnetic fields.
And we get into the Taurus formation, and you really wonder how far this does go out, because we're not alone just with our solar system. So then other stars connected to, and then how far does that connect, this interwoven web, and then the galaxies connecting to each other. And who knows if these galaxies are affecting each other, that we get down into our regional neighborhood here, if you will, on the spiral arm. And then, you know, the ancients had mapped this out a couple 100 million years to transit around, get back to the start point, where if you were going to transit around the entire Milky Way galaxy, 200 million years above and below the ecliptic. I mean, how many changes would there be, and how many effects from much farther out? We're talking hundreds, if not thousands of light years.
Exactly.
Of effects would come back and stimulate where we are. It's really interesting. A butterfly's wings, if you will, on our own planet can cause a hurricane on the other side of the world. Well, what happens if a Birkeland current decreases its output flow in a different part of the galaxy?
Exactly. And not even that, not even only that, but also in different galaxies. For instance, Cygnus A. Cygnus A is a giant ultramassive radio galaxy. And from our perspective on Earth, it's the second most powerful radio source in the sky. It's 700 million light years away. The Milky Way galaxy is only like 125,000 light years in diameter. So this thing is that far away, and we get stronger radio signals from a different galaxy than we get from our own galactic core. So this stuff is so interrelated, and there are so many variables that, you know, I'm a firm believer in things like Cygnus X3, the other end of the precessional cycle pole star, Deneb, the tail of the swan. I talk about it all the time. One of the most reliable cosmic ray sources in the entire universe. Now, the distance of that thing is questionable. We're not exactly sure how far away it is, because we're looking right down one of the Z fields. We're looking right down the pole of it. So basically, if you've been living in the northern hemisphere, this thing has been sending actual particles through your head for your entire life. You know, and there's all kinds of other cosmological stuff that probably isn't a coincidence. I mean, I heard Ben Davidson talking about around the solstice. We're just supposed to believe that the North Pole aligns with the center of the galaxy at right around the solstice. Like, it just happens to be a coincidence, right? So it's like astronomy is scary, really scary, but I'd rather know than not know.
Yeah, that's so true. And again, that's going to be an arrow in your quiver, is having knowledge of why these changes are occurring versus coming at it with fear. Because as I've been saying all along about the wake up of the general populace coming across the planet, it's going to occur later at the end of this year, sometime in 2019 into 2020.
Yeah.
And you know how the human populace reacts to stimulus. They're more on the fear base than the knowledge base. But if you really understand what's going on, you can also understand that there's ways to mitigate, prepare for this, get ready, and you're going to survive these changes, because we're still here. These cyclic patterns of building of societies into the apex of art, technology, mathematics, and everything in between. And then we come into these darker ages where it seems that the progress for the previous generations or civilizations are set back, or there's at least a stagnation. Well, this is what we're coming into, because if there's not enough food on the planet to feed everybody, there's just going to be lower productivity in general due to economy and all these interwoven facets. Because if food rises 4x and you're literally paying 4 times more for your food, the other disposable money that you would spend out for movies, electronics, travel, and whatever it is that you do with your extra money is going to disappear into a certain sector. So the general economy is going to deflate on one side, but it's going to hyperinflate on the food processing and that vertical stream over there, what's happening with agriculture and anything into the supermarkets. And, you know, if you know what's happening, you can definitely prepare for this. And that's another reason that I wanted to bring you on today to talk about some of the solutions and just get better knowledge so you're not scared and you can explain it to somebody else in a layman's, easy to understand terms of what's going on. So if they ask, you can explain it.
I mean, I say it all the time. It's just, even if you don't have any capacity to do anything to prepare, if you can't afford a bug out bag, and let's say you live in the city someplace, I don't know, in Indonesia or someplace that's right in the middle of our daily earthquake watch zone. Just the idea that you might be involved in a 6 or 7 magnitude earthquake, stepping out the front door and looking up and see if there's going to be a possible gargoyle falling on your head that weighs 7,000 pounds or not, can make a huge difference. Just the idea that you're going to panic a little bit less than somebody that you're trying to save because you had some idea something was going to happen. So I think it's in everybody's best interest to get a little bit out of their comfort zone at least. I'm a crappy gardener. That's why I'm growing tomatoes and garlic and other stuff inside the house. I had enough foresight last year before the frost came in. I saw some tomatoes that were sprouting in our compost area. So I was like, well, if they can grow in that low light region, I guess I might as well just bring them in the house and not let them get frosted over. And as a result of that, I'll get, I think I got 4 or 5 tomatoes going now. So I'll get at least 4 or 5 tomatoes worth of seeds. And that's a huge deal because now those seeds will be, they'll be epigenetically predisposed to growing where I want them to grow with, just LED lights inside the house. And I'll also have a huge head start when the late spring comes this year, like it did last year. Hopefully Canada won't be half frozen into May like it was last year, and there's a lot of other stuff too. Like, for instance, Russia has just created a ministry to consider the idea of not exporting wheat. And as soon as food starts driving prices up, everybody's Google stock is getting sold real fast because all that stuff is a bubble economy, speculative investment bought with cheap money, created by the Federal Reserve. And that's the first stuff to go away. It's speculative investments are gone as soon as you're hungry.
Yeah, I'll agree. And all we have to do is take a repeat look at 2008, 9, and 10. What's on our doorstep is going to be the exact same thing, but this time there'll be no quantitative easing. There'll be no stimulus money because what the Fed can't control is food prices. They can pretty much control everything else, but that is the Achilles heel of the Fed is the actual food pricing. They steal 2% from our wages every year through inflation, but the food is uncontrollable, literally. So when you think about that as the only facet that they really cannot control due to demand drive, they can't print that away. You're hungry every day, period.
Speaking of which, before I forget to ask you about it, we just recently have started trying to do some other things here to get a little healthier. Now, I am a pro cyclist who's unable to retire. But besides that, we've been making other little tweaks, doing things like switching certain things to organic, like one at a time to see if there's any effects. And we recently switched to organic coffee, and we thought that there was quite a bit of a difference there in that coffee beans are like the most highly pesticided crop in the world, right?
So what'd you feel? What'd you find? What was the difference?
I noticed that when I switched to like an organic coffee that I didn't feel jittery. I still felt maybe slightly energized, but I associated with coffee with feeling jittery. And when I switched to organic coffee, I don't feel jittery anymore. So do you think that was pesticide like glyphosate or mycotoxin or any ideas on that one? Because that was kind of odd. I wasn't expecting such a noticeable difference. It also tasted milder.
Yeah, what I like to do is mix coconut oil with my coffee because the coffee speeds through you, but the coconut oil grabs and bonds to the molecule and allows it to last much longer in your system. So that caffeine bonds to the coconut oil, the molecules itself. So as the fat burns, it burns the caffeine with it. So I find if I have coconut oil combined with the coffee, that same kind of extended, and then I'll drop in some L-theanine and a few other nootropics in there. Yeah, to keep that firing off. Just real simple one. Natural stack with the coffee, L-theanine, maybe some vinpocetine and ginkgo or something.
But what I'm really asking
that really lasts quite longer. with the
How
coffee.
crucial
Sure.
how crucial do you think it is to drink organic coffee instead of like Maxwell House?
I don't drink Maxwell House. I used to trade coffee out of Myanmar. That's the whole reason I started my channel. For those of you who don't know
Like me.
about the inception of Adapt 2030, I
Okay,
used to
yeah,
buy
tell us.
coffee. Yeah, let me throw the story out for everybody. David Dubyne here. I used to be a coffee buyer in Myanmar, otherwise known as Burma, back when the British controlled it. Now, this is a tropical area on the planet. Where we were buying coffee was a little further up on what they call the Midlands there, the Pin Oluwin area, about a
Okay.
thousand meters up. But we used to export coffee out of there. And what the coffee farmers were telling us that they had cold weather damage for the previous 2 years. So I started first going down there around 2012, just when they
Okay.
were opening up. And we exported coffee for about 2 years out of there and cold damage every single year. And the reason I was even ran into John Casey's work was we were doing a allocation forecast to see if we could expand our business, because you have to prepay the farmers to put the plantings out in the field. If you're going to
Okay.
get expansion for your tonnage coming in, you have to prepay for that, and then they plant everything.
I
But the
see.
problem was they were losing about 14% or so, 13, 14, 12% of new plantings every year due to cold damage.
In
And then
2012,
also,
wasn't 2012 the hottest year ever?
Eva was 98, I think.
Oh, okay. All right. Just checking.
But it was really a red flag, because I used to believe in global warming. I really did. I watched all the Al
Sure.
Gore movies. I saw all that stuff
Oh
with The
yeah, yeah.
Inconvenient Truth, and I was into it. And save the planet, save the whales, save the
Sure,
seals.
yeah.
I
Same
believe
here.
that too. Get the pollution. I don't like plastics in our ocean.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. I'm not
But
like in
it
the
turned out,
pocket of big oil or anything.
yeah, no. No, but Dan, seriously, that I couldn't find the answers, because I was thinking about, all right, if it's cold damage, I got to look for reasons they're cold, because I was told it was global warming. We got places in Burma here, Myanmar, that are cooling every single year. So I reached out to John Casey, and then I found his work, and then we conversed a few times, and it was game on from that point. I'm like, you know what? Everything I've been told has been a lie. Everything I've been told is a mistruth, and I couldn't figure it out as why. And then more information came in about the global tax scheme and the control, and putting people into more dense habitation zones, and controlling through smart grids and smart cities what we can consume in terms of resources. But that's a whole nother rabbit hole in itself. But the whole coffee
Indeed.
buying thing in Myanmar is the reason I even started the channel, because the cold damage didn't make sense down there to me. And it
Ah, okay.
shouldn't to you listeners either. Cold damage in Burma on the coffee plantations and the coffee farms is not what we were told would happen in global warming, but it did, and it still persists to this day. The bean density is lower. The top kill on the leaves is increasing every year. They actually
Okay.
have to plant much more. They're planting up to 20% new plantings, know that they're going to get knocked back to about 15.
Oh, geez.
Yeah, so if you want to put out 20 new acres, you need to put out 25.
Oh,
So you can
wow.
get down
Okay.
to 20, right? This is what's happening down there in Myanmar still. And Thailand is the same way. I took some trips to Thailand to source out some coffee, and Laos as well. They're all experiencing Southeast Asia that same exact thing. That
So
cold
now what?
weather is killing the smaller plantings and damaging the bean, the density, and the leaves on the more mature plants, 4,
Huh.
5, 7 years or something.
So what about the possibility that the North Pole is moving in that direction? Do you think that's responsible? Because when you have poles, you tend to get colder air around the poles because of the way water behaves, and that affects the rest of the atmosphere. Is that the reasoning behind why you think it's why there's increased cold damage in that area, or do you think it's something else?
Well, it's an interesting thing that you said, because the polar wander that's happening now, everybody's saying, oh, look, since the 1600s, the North Pole is migrating toward Kamchatka Peninsula area in Russia. But if
Yeah,
you
yeah.
look back at the poles, or the magnetic poles that they've mapped out since the year 200 AD, if you go back to 200 AD, you find the pole almost in the exact same trajectory and position it should be in about 4 or 5 years from now. If it continues in that direction, clipping along faster and faster each year, it'll end up pretty much in that same area over physical Russia. It's going off the water straight over into Russia, west of the Kamchatka Peninsula. And that's where it was in 200 AD, and then it flipped back and has moved around the North Pole to where it is now, and it's going back to the same place. It's almost like it's a 2,000-year cycle we're into. versus a
Jeez.
400 year. That's why I keep talking about a more powerful cycle at times, because the magnetic pole seems to be mimicking or repeating a cycle once again.
Yeah, and that's a question I get on my channel all the time. You know, when do you predict the Earth's pole flip is going to happen? And oh man, talk about a tough question to answer. You know, that requires a paragraph long answer with like 1,000 words, because it's like, well, first of all, I think it'll happen during a solar polar field flip. That seems to only make sense because I'm not somebody who believes in an internal dynamo inside of the Earth. I don't believe that that is there. You got to show me observational evidence to believe that that's a thing. And so if you don't believe that there's an internal dynamo inside of the Earth, then there's obviously something external powering the magnetosphere. You don't need moving parts. All you really need is moving electrons to get all of the features that we see happening. And those go through stuff. So, and they go around things. You know, you don't need an ocean of iron underneath the planet to do that. But if that's the case, then what causes the sun to do it? Well, it's probably something external to the sun too. Is it a different galaxy? Is there any way we can predict it? So that's part of the reason why we try to tie together the cosmic rays. And there's another possibility that the cosmic rays and the the solar activity are correlated. Perhaps it's not a causational relationship. You can't say for sure that it is. So, you know, they're trying to crunch all the variables, man, but it gets a little bit tough sometimes. And I got to say, the level of responsibility on my channel keeps going up because people keep asking harder and harder questions. So it's been quite a journey, and frankly, we're hoping we see a stronger cycle 25. There's a lot of people that are very. If you suggest cycle 25 is going to be stronger, there are people that are going to flip out on you about it. Not that I care if anybody flips out, because it happens to me all the time. And by the way, I don't work for the CIA, if you were wondering. all of my training is private. None by any government ever.
Yeah, and if I could interject there, Dan, nor I don't work for big oil. Everybody accuses me on the green side of working for big oil. I never taken a dime from big oil. Never have. It's my own opinion too of things are changing naturally.
Yeah, when I was a day trader in 2000, 2001, actually 99 through 2002, I'll say, I kept oil stocks out of my portfolio because I didn't understand the economy back then. Since then, fortunately, I did learn about it because I understood the Federal Reserve. That was the little piece that I was missing. Once I understood how that relates in such an unfortunate way to the rest of the economy, it kind of all made sense after that. But man, talk about a rabbit hole. Why do you keep commenting? Why do you keep forecasting the sun, Dan? It's because the sun's part of the economy.
Yeah, and it truly is. And what we talk about here with the sun in itself is not going to set civilization back. The problem is the food or lack thereof is going to push us back, a civilization reset button. All these variables, the IPCC says, oh, the climate science is settled. Well, it's not, because even just last year, they're adding in different kind of cloud vapor loops down in the southern hemisphere that they magically just discovered or forgot that they added. You're telling me you forgot cloud vapor down? Are you kidding me?
Yeah,
so
really.
All these variables out there, how many more variables can we discover? And here's the rabbit hole issue too, is we're going to learn so much about the sun and what happens in these next few years, because we have incredible, technology and electronics, satellites to measure this, take a look at it.
And the Parker Solar Probe also is a good one.
Yeah, there's probes, satellites, counters, everything in between. But you really have to wonder, the previous civilizations and societies, as we go back through history, as we go back through different ice ages, back hundreds of thousands of years, they were, according to the legends, incredibly advanced. And what knowledge did they have that they had either encoded in stelae and different types of temple iconography that has been hidden from us? So you almost need to think over the last 500 years, as the conquistadors and different raiders of civilizations went around, they took the best back, and it's in private libraries, etc. I am sure they have mapped this out way more in detail than anybody can imagine.
Yeah, and you look at the oldest artifacts in the world. The oldest sign of organized farming is, what is that, about 14,000 years old? Göbekli Tepe. I mean, what was up with that? I thought that it was impossible to have organized farming 14,000 years ago. That was like during a proper glaciation. So, it seems to be aligned at Deneb and not at Sagittarius, just like the pyramids, and all these things are built on top of other things. Plus, we have a geologic catastrophe cycle that, I mean, if you study geology by about 10th grade, you're going to learn that there's some crazy layer called the KT boundary where there's some kind of unexplainable catastrophe that occurred on the Earth not all that long ago. So it would really behoove mankind to figure out all that stuff, get it out to everybody, so that resources could be allocated appropriately instead of the way they are now, because resources are allocated horrendously badly.
I would agree, but as we have the discussion here, it's the greatest opportunity in human history, at least in
Yeah,
terms of this iteration of it. There's more wealth, technology, communication, connectiveness at this point in human history than we've ever had. So
I think
there's
so.
more opportunity. So when we look at this as a huge problem that needs to be fixed, we can also look at the amount of opportunity as something exponential, because it's going to be implemented everywhere, in every
Yep.
continent, every city, every place on this planet is going to need the same type of fixed tech to bring everything indoors for vertical farming or whatever it is. I don't know. Rotary drums, anything we could do to grow food. It's all going to have to migrate that way, and the amount of investment capital with it's going to just trail and lead it right in there. So it is a huge, huge opportunity if you can see what's in the future and understand that this money is going to be redirected somewhere else.
Exactly. And oh, by the way, before I forget, I wanted to let you know about this growing system that I came up with here. A free way to sprout and grow small plants like seedlings inside. So have you ever seen, I don't know if you have this in Myanmar. Are you always in Myanmar, or do you head back to the US sometimes?
I live around in Taiwan at the moment, up in
Okay.
Taipei.
Well, we recently also switched to organic eggs because that's a huge deal. Eggs are a big part of the diet and they're pretty cheap. So it's, can't really afford to do everything organic all the time, but certain stuff you want to make a priority out of it, right? Well, we noticed these eggs from Lancaster here. I'm in Eastern Pennsylvania, by the way. They're just, let's see, Noah's Pride brand cage-free organic brown eggs, right? Well, they come in this container that's it's like a clamshell. So it's like three pieces. You got the bottom and the top of the clamshell that's egg-shaped. And then there's also a clear plastic lid that goes off of that. You can easily pull the label out of the top of it. And these things are like micro greenhouses. I gotta put a video of this once I plant something in it on my thing, because it's such a waste to recycle these things when you can use it to grow plants. They're a little more expensive, but if you figure the benefit that you get from the organic eggs instead of the mass-produced factory farm eggs, and you're using it as it's like a miniature greenhouse, man. You got to see these things. It's amazing. It's made out of this perfect clear plastic. You could even have these things outside and close the lid, and it would like survive a hailstorm. So it's trying to come up with new and innovative routes to accomplish a lot with a little, the way any mountain biker would.
Yeah, or any hiker, anybody in a situation where you need to provide for yourself if something goes wrong and breaks down.
Yep.
Athletes and persons in the outdoor, even if it's recreational outdoor, scuba divers, whatever it is, if there's something that comes up that's unplanned, at least
Mm-hmm.
you're more in the mind frame of being able to solve these problems. So if we can take that to a wider scale and interject it into this next decade, okay, there's something huge coming. Your tire just went flat. Oh, how are you going to fix that thing? All right. It
Exactly.
was this gear broke. Something happened with the chain. It was a lot of whatever we're throwing away now. This is where you get into these stories of your grandparents saving everything from the Great Depression, right? They were
Oh
trying to
yeah.
work the same magic of don't throw anything away. We could possibly reuse it for something. And you got to think,
Yeah.
it was
Exactly.
that bad in the 1930s when there were only 6 times less people on the planet. What's it going to be like when it happens during this time when there's almost 8 billion people on. Because during the Great Depression, there were 1.5, 1.6 billion people on the planet during that time.
Must have been something like that, yeah.
Yeah, in the 1930s. So think about where we're going to go. If it was that bad back then, when there was enough game to hunt, everybody knew how to farm, everybody knew how to hunt, trap, fish. People knew how to repair their own. People knew how to sew their own clothing, make their own clothing, repair everything, and they still struggled. So what's it going to be like now when very few people know how to do much of anything?
Well, and that's one of the other reasons that we study cosmology. People like Dr. Pierre-Marie Robitaille, trying to figure out what the sun's really made out of, because the sun is the Rosetta Star for the rest of the universe. What any star is doing, we base our invalid fusion core gaseous plasma model of the sun to try to guess things like that star's mass and all that stuff. And that stuff is all cartoonish non-science that came out in the 1860s. The sun appears to be made of condensed matter, otherwise its spectra wouldn't be the way it is. And a fusion core doesn't explain anything like sunspots or granules or the cycles or coronal holes or any of that kind of stuff. And I'm a firm believer that once we get the physics correct on this, it's going to open up a whole new world of more technology. So that could be the kind of thing that prevents a thing like a solar minimum from having as big of an impact. And I think, there's been a lot of scientific innovation since 1929. So put it this way, I don't think the Earth's population is maxed out at 8 billion. I just think that resources aren't allocated correctly. And I think there are too many people that have no clue what's going on because they're trapped in the daily slog of their lives. They don't have enough food, or they got a dirt floor and no electricity because they live in a fourth world country. But at the same time, people that live in first world countries are stretched to well beyond where they should be. I was telling people to buy silver when it was $14 an ounce. And, plenty of people were still allowing their payroll deductions to buy a bunch of Google and Apple stock. Also, I think another important thing to do too is to do stuff like force on force training. Without getting too much into guns, but I got my girlfriend an airsoft pistol for Christmas so we can shoot at each other, because it's nice to know what the lines are like around your home. It's like, hey, why did you buy your girlfriend a gun? So she can shoot me. Perfectly good reason. I mean, she has a real one too, but you never know what it's like trying to reload when somebody's shooting at you until you're trying to reload while somebody's shooting at you, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, bring that up. And again, these kind of basic skills that everybody's going to need in the future, just basic firearms training is going to absolutely be needed, either for hunting in itself or for defense. And don't delude yourselves to believe that we're going to go quietly kumbaya into the night if we get enough money for indoor vertical agriculture. It just doesn't work like that. In my own opinion, personally, you can agree or disagree. I just think that we're not going to have enough food to feed the planet, and there's going to be a real push and pull to see who gets allocated those grain resources. So you said in the beginning when we were talking that Russia was going into not export meat. Well, you just saw that they reduced their grain output exports as well. Forecast.
Not meat, wheat.
Wheat.
Yeah, Russia's the largest exporter in the world of wheat, and
that's exactly the same I'm talking about too. They're going to cut those grain yield. They're not going to be sending those exports out any longer.
Yeah, we probably read the same article.
Yeah, but you got to get this. They were trying to say, the news article, at least the way that was explained to me, was the farmers and the citizens of the country were in such an uproar that Russia was going to export the wheat that it was going to drive up internal costs that started pressuring or rioting or protesting or whatever. So the Russian government backed down. Now, you and I both know that's a fallacy, because just like they would be, the Chinese government backed down, Russian government backed. No, they didn't. They just are using that as a convenient ploy to give an excuse not to export. And I don't blame them one iota, because they understand what's coming.
I think what happened was they ended up making what amounts to a new cabinet department to, I don't know, have a panel or whatever, but to actually kind of like the way the U.S. created the Department of Homeland Security in 2001.
Department of the Grand Solar Minimum.
Yeah. The Grand Solar. Yeah, the Cosmology Department of the U.S. That would be good.
I wish we'd actually start these debates, but nobody is willing to. Here, Ocasio-Cortez going off on the Green Deal, and not, I did two videos talking about the volcanic eruptions during these grand solar minimums would reduce solar panel output anyway, just through history when we see the amount of volcanism associated with the grand solar minimum. So knowing in advance to build solar panels when there's going to be more volcanic dust in the air makes absolutely zero sense to me. But nobody's willing to talk about it too. I just don't understand why.
The worst part, man, is that all the hysteria is based on the false premise that CO2 has anything to do with temperature on this planet, other than the fact that CO2 goes up after the temperature does, because more life grows, especially in the oceans, via photosynthesis. It's shocking. You try to debate somebody on this kind of a subject, and you don't even know where to start. It's like, where do we start? Oh, okay, we got to reduce CO2 emissions. Well, why? Because the planet's getting hot, but it's not. The ice sheets are going to melt. Well, ice sheets are sea ice. If you have a glass with ice cubes in it, does the water level rise when the ice cubes melt? It's just you on and on and on with articles every day. Like every article that has anything to do with planet Earth has to slip in some kind of thing. Polar bears are invading Russian towns because of global warming. No, they're invading Russian towns because it's too frozen in the Arctic for them to get through the ice to seals.
Yeah, they had to kill quite a few last year in Newfoundland as well, up in Labrador area of Canada, because the same thing, the polar bears were coming into the towns.
Yeah.
And it seems that there's a plethora of polar bears. We've been told that polar bear populations are declining due to global warming, but the newest census put it, this is the Canadian Ice Service, they put it around 25,000 polar bears, but back in 1970s, there were only 5,000 polar bears. So literally the polar bear population is 5 times greater than it was in the 1970s. And it seems that, whatever happened with the sea ice is the exact same thing in Russian town as was in Canada and Newfoundland last year, where they had to put down a bunch of these bears due to them coming in. You can't even go out of your house. Polar bears are outside.
Yeah.
Calling off school because the polar bears are outside. Imagine we have a polar bear day. No snow day. We got a polar bear day.
Cold kills polar bears. Warm doesn't kill polar bears. Warm doesn't kill people. Cold kills people. So the whole debate is so ridiculous. The Minoan warm period was 2.5 degrees warmer than it is now, and that's Celsius. And by the way, if you're worried about Antarctica thawing, Antarctica formed 34 million years ago when it was 3 degrees C warmer than it is now. So it's like you have to come out with an encyclopedia of refutations to like even refute anybody. Like it's practically on the realm of the flat Earth debates at this point. It's so ridiculous.
If I could throw a little caveat in here, quiz time.
All right.
For those of you out in listening land.
Uh-oh.
Extinction level event on the planet Earth. What are the parts per million when it goes below that? What is the total ppm for carbon dioxide? When below that threshold, it's an extinction level event for all planet life and the flora fauna on this planet. At what ppm level do we need to be an extinction level event where there's not enough of it that life ceases on the planet?
You're saying when there's not enough carbon dioxide?
Correct. What's the ppm measurement when we go into an extinction level event because there's not enough CO2 to drive everything else that's going on in terms of the life web?
I have no idea, but I'll bet you got an answer.
280.
Oh, geez.
Yeah, we're at 410, and I'm like, as more northward we can go away from that ELE kind of number at 280, please get me higher. I want to go higher. I want to go further away, but nobody ever talks about that. We are literally just hundreds of, like 100 and some ppm away from an extinction level event. The highest levels they've recorded are 7,000 ppm on the planet here.
I know, and we're building CO2 sequestration machines to try to scrub the CO2 out of the air. It's insanity.
And how much really are they going to pull out in the entire scheme of things? And they
I
never really
know. What?
talk about the major polluters. They always talk about what the westernized first world nations could do.
Yeah,
What about all the developing nations that are still burning unfiltered coal? Just everything is going up
right.
the stack. There's nothing on. There's no scrubbers on anything. It's just burn, 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 and just make an economy. Well, no, they don't tell any of them to pull back their usage or construction
Yeah,
or
exactly.
energy. No. What is this with this? Only half the world needs to abide by it. The other half can still add CO2. It doesn't make sense.
It's pretty crazy. You know, the two most populous countries in the world are producing the most CO2, aren't they? India and China.
But they're allowed to they have a special hall pass to be able to put more CO2 up because they're still developing.
Oh, okay. Well, good for them.
But it's such a global emergency. We need to tax you and make you walk to work uphill both ways for 5 miles. But they can
Yeah, it's
still
pretty crazy.
burn.
Well, maybe, you know, I saw I was at the Bernie Sanders School of Economics the other day, which is an outhouse, and I was really hoping that they would gut that building and insulate it because it was kind of cold in there. There's a lot of dust too, and no books.
Yeah, and you had to go with your lantern, huh? Oh, don't burn the lantern. You get to put CO2 up there with your kerosene.
No, I used a solar panel charged LED bar for it. Now, that's what Bernie told me to use. So
Yeah. And as we get through with this insanity of the politicians trying to push their own dog and pony tricks through to get more votes for the younger generation who's been indoctrinated literally for their entire lifetime into this whole debate of a CO2, oh, we have all these solutions. It can only be solar, it can only be wind. What I wanted to talk to you about here for a second is Ocasio-Cortez never mentioned once gravitational vortex power. She never talked about trying to dust off the patents from Marconi, from Tesla, from Rife, and from Dr. Brown for
oh yeah.
electrogravitics, to try to work with any of that on the Earth's magnetic grid to power devices. Forget burning anything. Why don't we just use the Earth's magnetic field to push magnets to make electricity? No, they don't want to talk about that. It only can be
Yeah,
wind
I
and
mean,
solar. Makes no
I
sense. There's
first
all these other options they're not even considering or they won't talk about.
exactly. I mean, I first heard about zero point energy in probably like the year 2000 or so, and it was just a show on the Learning Channel. I didn't necessarily believe it. The guy sounded like a kook. But I mean, the deeper you get into the physics of this stuff, the more you study things like David LaPointe's work on plasma and stuff like that, it's like there's got to be a way to make a generator that has zero friction out of this stuff. So I think, you know, I think there's some possibility that even if we went into a proper glaciation, the human race could largely survive. Although if you get an event like the Doug Vogt catastrophe cycle, that's yeah, that'll be a little that would be bad. Let's just say the Doug Vogt scenario would be bad.
Are you talking
But
about a mini nova from the sun, where he's talking
yeah,
about the granules pounding onto the moon and different things that they found up there?
yeah, and you know the possibility that the Earth stops its rotation and then in within one day reverses its rotation and so on as an explanation for the geologic layers at the KT boundary and stuff like that. There's a lot of scenarios, but even with a scenario like that, if human resources were allocated better than they are, there'd be a much better chance to save, you know, 30% of the entire species or something like that. And, you know, again, hot doesn't kill people, cold kills people. If it gets too hot, you know, you take your shirt off. If it gets too cold, you freeze into a block of ice. Being hot doesn't necessarily, like, of course everybody uses air conditioning in hot areas. I understand that hot temperatures cause the electrical grid to have increased strain on them, but ultimately what it comes down to is if the planet gets like a degree colder, you're going to have spring isn't going to arrive in the northern US until June, and that's going to be a problem for things like, especially like agriculture. I think if everybody just was a little bit better, and this is why I'm trying to improve my growing skills because I'm terrible at it. But man, I got to tell you, my skills have increased in leaps and bounds over the past few months. Just growing these indoor tomatoes, I've learned so much just through trial and error, essentially. And I'm also trying to get some mold resistant strains too, because mold is a huge problem for a ton of people. And the more stagnant things get, the more moldy things get. And I actually have a couple plants here that I've cured of mold. I trimmed leaves off of them. I know this is super controversial, but I trimmed leaves off of them and they didn't die. They continued to grow. So I kind of just kept them away from the rest of the plants. And I'm pretty sure I'm going to have some mold resistant seed strains here.
Yeah, and the airflow and everything as well. But I
Oh,
want to bring
yeah.
it back to the reversing Earth for a second here. That's not possible in science and what they just, it is possible, but it's just conjecture so far. But if you look
Right.
back into the ancient accounts from China to the Bible and everything in between, they talk about the Earth standing still and then
Yeah.
re-rotating. So it's at least happened once during at least the written records of our own last 12,000 years, at least once it's happened because it's in these cultures across the planet. The
I
Earth
think
stood
so too.
still, and then it started to re-rotate, and the sun
Yeah.
rose in the wrong direction. It rose from the west, so
Uh-huh.
then it had to have re-reversed itself because now it rises from the east. So whatever
Yeah.
happened back then, it had to have at least had one more turnaround to bring it back to the original east-west direction.
Right. And I would think it's very important also to note the fact that uh, this catastrophe may happen at the end of the glaciation, not at the beginning of the glaciation. The glaciation might happen rather suddenly too, but you can't say for sure. And of course, obviously we can't see all of the cycles and we can't necessarily predict how they all overlap each other. We've only been counting sunspots for, I guess, counting the Chinese ones, what, 1,000 years or so?
About, yeah, they would use a piece of paper with a pinhole in it, and then
Okay.
it would drop a shadow on another surface. They
Right, right.
wouldn't look directly at it, but they would have a pinhole. And then again, were able to see cosmic rays coming out of this. Apparently, I don't know exactly how you do that with the visible spectrum, but they
Huh.
would show what looked like filaments and different rays coming out or entering into the sun with that. And then it
Okay.
would come along with the legend of the three-footed crow. And you wonder, was that a massive coronal hole? But again, you can't see coronal holes with your eyes unless something really changes in the sun that we're not expecting. Where
Yeah,
these
yeah.
accounts in the ancient Chinese relating it to mythical birds across the sun and giant portions of the sun that are black, because they specifically talked it being a black crow with 3 feet. Now, would that have been filament plasma streamers coming off with some kind of central body? Would it
Could
be
have been.
an inbound field or a Birkeland current coming in that created the beak or whatever? But all these ancient stories are related mythically to the sun, that they saw something visibly, at least enough to categorize it. Well, it looked like a black crow. Maybe they didn't
Right.
explain it was a coronal hole, or imagine if a sunspot the size of a quarter of the sun comes across. How would that would be completely so far out of bounds of what would be expected. But how would you explain it to somebody and then pass that down as our own knowledge, and then somebody 4,000 years in the future would read our writings and go, what were they talking about?
Yeah, I hear you. If I saw a sunspot that big, I don't know how I'd explain it. I'd have to figure out a way though, because I'd be putting out a video in the morning about it. So I'd figure something out. try to have some clue about what the magnetic fields are doing, if they're shrinking or growing. Geez. So
Yeah, and
it's yeah, it's
imagine trying to
interesting, and
explain that. You
you got
couldn't
you got
do
to
it.
wonder. You got to wonder, is the nova event, associated with a turned on sun or a turned off sun? Does the solar nova event, if you believe in it in the first place, does it come out of a coronal hole when the sun flares out? Like what happens if a coronal hole stretches all the way from the north solar pole to the south solar pole? Or does it come out of a sunspot? Is it a result of high activity or low activity? You can't possibly know unless you've time traveled or something, right?
Yeah, I'm looking back in more ancient history. I'm looking at as the activity state of the sun declines, there's got to be some equilibrium happening. So if it's an overcharged capacitor, if you will, a cosmic capacitor, as just a simple example, if that electrical charge needs to go somewhere, if it's overcharged. Now, what you find routinely, if you look back, what are the numbers that keep recurring again and again all through all cultures? And we go back thousands of years, it's the same numbers repeating again and again.
Oh yeah, it
36,
sure is.
36. So I was talking with Rolf Witche, and he was saying, yeah, if we get down in the 30s, there's a very possibility that this is going to happen. We don't even have to go anywhere close to zero. but why do the ancients keep pointing to 36? So I think there's some, I'm just throwing out here what my thoughts are. Perhaps it is when there's a 31 in that solar wind and the field current comes down to 36%, something flips at that point, and that's what sends everything into motion.
Yeah,
Because I don't know why these same numbers are so ingrained across all cultures on the planet. It has to be something with a percentage-wise, or I mean, you can go into the numerology and magic and everything, but that's completely different. I'm just talking about marking in time for things that will never, ever, ever be forgotten because they put it in religion and belief. These numbers are everywhere. Why are they here all the time? 36.
Even the Wu-Tang Clan was into 36.
I remember the Wu-Tang Clan.
Yeah, 36 Chambers, man. Most historic hip-hop albums of all time.
That was way back in the day when the scene was first getting started.
Oh, yeah, that was 1991.
Run DMC baby. Was back at that same era, yeah. That was a solid music back then.
Right on.
Groovy, baby.
So what else is on your mind?
How the media is going to try to downplay this and deflect it and try to silence some of the information coming out as we move forward because they're going to want to control the narrative to try to prevent the panic. The panic's going to come anyway eventually. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. It's like being on the Titanic. You watch that movie, and it's a perfect example of what's about to happen for our own society. When it first hits, the whole bunch of high-level people understand what's going on, the captain, the crew, etc. Then they go to the elite, the people with money, the first-class passengers, and they explain to them what's going on, and they all do their own maneuvers to get ready. Now, the rest of the people are left until the very last to understand what's going on, and once they understand it, they panic. So when we come into this, how would the global media, corporate-controlled mainstream media, how would they push the message to control that it's still CO2? Because everybody's going to be angry once they realize they've been lied to, and they could have had more time to prepare even from 2-3 years ago, 5 years ago.
Exactly.
And control the narrative so no outside information slipping into, put oil on top of the water here, if you will.
Well, that's a good point. And, I think that's part of the reason why your channel has such value, because you're not in the US. You cover a lot of world news that I don't see unless I specifically look for it at places like BBC or, Yahoo News India or whatever. So I think you get some insight into that we're not going to see here. Now, of course, it's not like I'm sitting here watching CNN ever or anything like that. But, that's a big deal. And I think that's a huge benefit, because you have insight, and plus I have a little bit of insight too that's not going to be covered in the news. And while I don't do my channel based on a professional capacity for my quote job, end quote, which is primarily for the purpose of food safety, but also for nutritional integrity and redundancy testing and a little bit of chemical synthesis our company does. But I get a little bit of insight because we're in the food supply chain. So when things start to change, if we start to see clients dry up, I won't be told directly that it's happened, but it does happen. Now, sometimes a client they'll just try out a different laboratory, but I do get some insight into that, into the entire, the laboratory that I work at, and I do field management, so I'm rarely at the laboratory, but our laboratory is the northeast portion of the entire North American continent. So I do have a little bit of insight that I can throw in there, just not in a official professional capacity.
Well, keep going. I'm very interested in what you just said, so I'm sure everybody else is. Can you enlighten us a little further? Add a little couple more nuggets on top of there.
Well, I've been with this company. I'll be with this company for 3 years in August, and my job is primarily go to the laboratory, figure out what the schedule is, and then I drive about 200 to 400 miles a day, just going to something like 2 to 5 clients. And I got to go visit their facility, and I have some insight into what their output is. I can't tell you who any of the clients are because there's confidentiality agreements. For instance, I can tell you that Burger King's not our client, However, if you were aware that Burger King was doing lab testing on their food and you had no idea what you were talking about, you might be concerned that their food's going to be tainted, as opposed to, realizing that it's probably going to be less likely to be tainted as a result of being tested. But so we operate in stealth. And that's why I don't give out very much information about what I do, because it needs to go on in the background of the supply chain. Nobody wants to think about salmonella or whatever. Well, our company is one of the major companies that is preventing that from happening. Now, if I saw any major things going on, I'd mention them. That wouldn't violate any confidentiality or anything like that. But at the same time, I know that there are some global crop losses, and they're serious. It's not normal for Paris to get a hailstorm where they get 12 inches deep hail. That's not normal weather. And just for the record, a cold atmosphere conducts electricity more easily than a hot atmosphere because it's denser. Just throw in that little piece of physics in there, because it's really important.
No, it's also it's beyond important, because you realize that those lines can ground out through the air if it truly gets that cold, because the insulation in Alaska, for example, they plan for that. But we're getting down where we saw these super freezes in Missouri and places like Chicago, a little bit further south, these all-time coldest temperatures ever. What if the next few years are even colder? Those lines are not planned for that. So it's very possible that current could find its way out through the cold and ground out through that medium that you're talking about. This is an elephant in the room that nobody wants to talk about at all.
Yeah, and there's a lot of people out there, and Thunderbolt's project just did a video about this. Just at the same time I was arguing with somebody in my comments section about it, that you don't need that liquid metallic core of the sun. You don't need that. You just need condensed matter with electric current passing through it. So it's kind of important. If you've got greater atmospheric conductivity, then the current's going to have an easier path. At the same time, the magnetosphere is shrinking. The ionosphere is getting closer to the planet. I've got tons of videos on my channel from over the summer where I have satellite images of Lichtenberg patterns over northern Pennsylvania and New York, and all kinds of Hall currents. And this is one of the reasons I have such a beef with the chemtrails thing, because people are looking at stuff happening in the atmosphere, persistent contrails. I'll be the first guy to say that's probably from cosmic rays, not from chemicals being sprayed out of a plane. So, I think there's all these fundamental misunderstandings going on, and it's helping to have people looking at the wrong variables instead of the right ones to understand what's going on above their heads. I see it all the time. I'll see a bunch of naturally occurring cloud patterns that are in a perfect parallel pattern. Sometimes it'll even look like the ground symbol on an electrical schematic. And when I look at the satellite data, I can see right where the Hall currents are. By the way, for viewers who aren't aware, a Hall current is the perpendicular current that comes out of an electrical field, or a magnetic field rather. So if you take a magnet and pass it through another magnet, you get electrical field lines that come out perpendicular to the motion of that. And that's largely what causes the Earth's jet streams. So all this stuff figures in together. And, people like Svensmark, who figured out that cosmic rays cause an increase in cloud nucleation, that's a big deal. So yeah, man, there's a lot that goes into it, and that's why we're poring over the data every day, trying to figure out if there's any correlation between something like the electron flux. I mean, we just had an article last week where a guy showed that the electron flux is associated with generating ozone around the equator. So there's so much stuff going on with it, and hey, maybe we'll discover something we didn't know yet. That's the whole point. We're kind of just pouring through the data every day, try to see if we have a little bit of perspective that nobody else has, or something like that, to perhaps make some sort of scientific difference. It's a rabbit hole that I went down when I was about 4 years old. Was the first time I ever heard of cosmic rays. And then let's see, fast forward to astronomy in college, where I started to learn about dark matter. And that turned me off to the entire field of astronomy for about 10 years. And I finally got back into it when I started studying the sun as a result of becoming a cyclist, because I realized that I can't predict the weather just by looking at stuff like temperature and barometric pressure and humidity. I need to look at more stuff than that. And so I ended up studying the sun even more. And here I am. Never expected to get to 1,000 subscribers, though. Really, I didn't expect to get to 100 subscribers. So it's kind of mind boggling in a way, and super interesting.
Yeah, and it's also refreshing to know that anybody can do this and take on their own study. You don't have to be an atmospheric physicist or have gone to university as a trained professional. You can always learn something on your own by taking a look at the resources available across the internet right now, where once you understand the key terms and how these graphs work, you can start to go through the data yourself every day and figure it out. And once you realize, hey, there's probably somebody out there that's not even going to be a trained scientist or physicist or astrophysicist that's going to put the actual missing piece in together. This is just how life works.
Yeah, we're hoping. Trying to get more people looking at it every day, you know?
Well, they will. I do believe. Now, so I want to talk about our last thing here before we wrap up. I wanted to talk about timelines for a second, because as more people start looking, which they're going to, there's going to be a tidal wave of new people searching out information on this. And as more people become aware, the economy is going to shift anyway, because people are going to sell their stocks to try to get prepared for this. So the economy crunch comes along with the knowledge of just that this is a long-term event, that we're not going to be a 1 or 2 year in and out. This is going to be a decade longer plus event. And people are really going to be stunned by it. Why didn't I hear about this before? So I better get ready too. So when we're looking out, my personal forecast is 2019-20. These changes amplify to such a degree that, we're in biblical proportion for every storm. And people really wake up and say, something's terribly wrong. It couldn't be CO2. It couldn't happen this fast. And it couldn't be this amplified, because they were talking about these changes 100 years from now. It's here now. So there's going to be a grandiose awakening. By 2021, this is where we get into the massive food shortages anyway, which was predicted as as we get toward that first field line cancellation that Valentina Zarkova puts in her charts here. Once we get around 2021, 22, we get that first canceling wave where the magnetic fields go out of phase and cancel each other out. I really believe 2021, 22 are going to be the major crop shortages. They're going to shake this planet. And as we move into 2024, we're going to reach that cold time. But then that's when we just start going into the second wave, which gives us a good indication after the first wave is we're in the build of it now, and then it should taper off, and those lines are going to come back, start to recharge, if you will, a little bit, come back more into a stable magnetic field, but then whoosh, they go right out again. So between now and 2030, we have 2 full waves of this. So I'm just curious what you think about the amplification timeline.
Well, I think the next cycle is going to be slightly stronger than the current cycle because of the way the magnetic fields look. But what it really comes down to is what the solar polar north field does, because it didn't flip properly last time, and it's up there folded right now. But now it's increasing in strength. So we have to see if we see like a normal 2-pole flip of the sun during this cycle, or maybe the south pole will go out of phase then also. That would be a very, very terrible sign. But you can't possibly know if that's going to happen for at least another, I'd say, 4 years at the very minimum, because this happens around solar max. So, and that is part of the other reason why we created this channel, is because we want to look at every little bit of the solar data as closely as possible during the minimum to try to get some kind of insight into what it's going to do. Refresh my memory. What was your question? I'm sorry, I went off on a tangent.
No, keep going with that, because everybody's looking for different comparisons on how strong the solar cycle 25 is going to be. And again, everybody's input into forecasting out as to where the solar intensity is going. But mine was just more about a in general economy and crop loss timeline that you might foresee based on all the solar activity declines. But you say you think that solar cycle 25 might be slightly stronger than 24. Well, that'll bring us right back into more stable weather versus tanking and going the other direction where these magnetic fields go out of line.
That will be optimal if that happened. But
that would be optimal.
Here's another thing, though. Cycle 24 is a very small cycle, no matter how you cut it. And the thing about temperature is that temperature lags a solar cycle. I say 2 years. Ben Davidson says 3 years. And some other folks are saying 20 to 25 years. And this has to do with the latency of heat in the ocean.
Mm-hmm.
And by the way, that's another variable not figured in properly with IPCC5's climate models. So the problem with measuring the atmosphere to determine what the temperature of the planet is that it has nothing to do with what the temperature of the planet is. You can't measure the atmosphere to figure out the Earth's temperature. You have to have buoys that are measuring temperature at like 15 meters deep all around the world's oceans. And we don't have that, which means we don't even know what the temperature is. You can't use satellite data to measure the temperature 15 meters deep in the Indian Ocean. So it takes at least 2 years, but as long as 20 years for the heat latency of the oceans to catch up. Those things are gigantic batteries. They emit radio frequencies and they emit infrared radiation constantly. So let's say the solar minimum of cycle 24 is today. The coldest temperatures aren't going to show up until 2021 in February. According to me. According to Ben Davidson, 2022. And according to some models, like 2040 or 2030, coincidentally.
Coincidentally for Adapt 2030.
Yeah.
And the Atlantic multi-decadal oscillation too. They never talk about AMO or Atlantic water temperatures on a 60-year cycle either. That's a natural cycle. And here it's cooling as well. So these next 30 years, the Atlantic's going cooler on a natural cycle.
And England is absolutely the canary in the coal mine.
It is right there on the edge.
When I first started studying, quote, global warming, end quote, it was in 1987 in 8th grade earth science class. I guess I'm dating myself now. And what I discovered was that even back then, it was a known thing that there's a negative feedback associated with global warming. If you heat up the Arctic warm enough that it interferes with the whatever you want to call it. It's called a whole bunch of different things. The AMOC, the North Atlantic Oscillation, whatever you want to call it. If that gets disrupted, most of Western Europe freezes. So if you see the Thames freeze, that's a very bad sign. And, I remember coming home from school one day and saying, "Hey, parents, you ever hear of global warming?" "No, what's that?" "Well, I found out today that it causes global colding, at least in the Northern Hemisphere." And they were like, "What?" So, I've been studying this stuff formally since 1987. I may not have a degree in something like atmospheric physics, but I'm more interested in cosmology anyway. Of course, I live on Earth, so I'm kind of interested in that too. It's such a double-edged sword, David. I don't know which way to go. I'm not sure what to do. I'm so confused.
Well, I think the past leads us to the future. I believe I really do. That's why I'm so heavily looking into the ancient societies and the cycles that they talked about, and then knowing that cycles return and looking at it from that direction. Our crystal ball is truly a history book. We've been through this before multiple times. So last 12,000 years, how many times we've been through this? 30 times already. So it's more of a shorter cycle anyway. Now, when we get into could it be a 2,000-year cycle, more heavy or powerful? Could it be a 3,600-year cooling cycle, more heavy, powerful? That's when, we get into all the extra variables in time. Like how intense would it be at a 2,000-year cooling cycle compared to a 400-year cooling cycle? So I do believe that the ancient writings or ancient texts that we're allowed to see within museums and collections across the planet, visible to the public, hold the answers we're looking for.
Isn't it amazing the way most of the stuff is going on right before your very eyes? You just have to know where to look at it. And, you just have to know where to find it in order to actually see it. It's like the idea that the sun doesn't have an internal nuclear dynamo is quite amazing, because if that's the case, then the sun's producing the heavy elements on the surface in essentially plain sight.
Well, that means every other orbital body around in our galaxy would behave would just suddenly everything we know about everything changes. And that again, that
Exactly.
whole dogma of holding the line there of belief, because once you let that go, wow, people are going to have a very difficult time coming to grips with what their reality is. Truly, and when I say that, I mean true physical reality, the
Oh
way they'll
yeah.
hold it together or not.
Oh
People
yeah.
are
It's
not
crazy.
not very happy and conducive to accept new information. Once they've been trained like a sheep, they're very happy to continue with the status quo and dogma as it is. They fear change. They fear new information, I believe, for a majority of people. And that's just the complete opposite for me. I don't like the static. I always like something new, something different. I'm always searching.
Yes, yes, that's good. That's the way to be, man. Use it or lose it. Do not be ossified in your beliefs.
Yeah, let me throw a
Science
little. Let me throw a. No, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Dan. You kicked you off
sci-
there.
science is a crazy thing because in my experience, most of the time when you try to figure out the answer to a very difficult question in science, you end up with about a dozen more questions, even if you got an answer. Does that make sense? In other words, the rabbit hole keeps getting deeper.
And then it goes 12 dimensions wider.
Yeah, I think so. The multiverse exposes itself at that point, right?
Yeah, because speaking of the rabbit hole, I was traveling in Croatia and we went to this museum in Zadar. This town's about 2,000 years old.
Nice.
And yeah, and then on the third floor up there on the museum top, they had the ancient cultures that were around, or the ancient civilizations of that area in the Balkans. Now, as I
Uh-huh.
started in the beginning, it was very primal, going back 25, 30,000 years, a few skulls. But then there was a central area there where they had the cult of the sun. And I thought, I
Nice.
never heard about this. Let me dig into it more. So
Hey, I got a
I
good one
took
for
a
you to
bunch of
watch.
pictures, and I still need to get into the research. But with all the stuff we're doing, it's
I I
one
have a
day at a
great
time.
I have a great video for you to watch if you're interested in that kind of stuff. Uh, do a search on YouTube for "Is the Sun Conscious?" It's a Thunderbolts project video. Ancient cultures just simply believed that the sun was conscious, that it was a god or a goddess. And really, if you look at the way the entire universe is construed, the perhaps maybe the sun's a nerve bundle. The way the surface of the sun is set up, there's all these electrical connections there. It's not really that different from your brain when you think about it. So there's some weird stuff out there, man. There's too many rabbit holes. You end up with a broken ankle if you spend too much time. And I'm not suggesting that the sun is conscious. I'm just saying that there's some interesting videos about it out there. Although
Well,
if
I
it
will
was
talk
conscious,
about star consciousness for a second, then, if I could throw that point out here.
yes, please.
In China, in the Taoist beliefs, they call it the Beidou Qixing, which is the cult of the Big Dipper. Now, they
Okay.
believe that is where the seed point of consciousness originates from, is the Big Dipper itself, and the stars contained within.
Huh.
Yeah, and there's a whole in the Taoist traditions, and they have a set of 36. Oh, there's that magic number again.
Oh
36
boy.
protector weapons that were used to protect humanity. Now, if you look at them, they very much look like zeta pinches or bulge currents coming
Oh,
through.
really?
And if you start to, what I've really done is I've photographed the entire collection. I've tried to put it together more or less, looking at, uh, I should say, celestial phenomenon in an electrical fashion. And the representations of dragons, just even now today, they still understand it as plasma. Like the representations
Wow.
that you see, especially on what I've noticed on temples, is you'll see like a high current flow with the dragon coming in due to
Yeah,
how
yeah.
much fire's under the sun. Or if you look on the other side, it's a low current inflow, and the number of sunspot dots on it, and also the amount of flame coming off, just
Yeah.
definitely
Yep.
shows that they were very aware that there were high activity states in the sun and low activity states, but they represented it differently. And then the cult of the Big Dipper and all these things pointing toward pole stars, and owls and owl nebula and pyramids and within the owl nebula at the seed point of human consciousness. It really gets deep into it, and you come back, and Japan and China are the places you want to go if you want to start looking down star rabbit holes.
Interesting. Well, I mean, think about it this way. If there's a star, and I'm talking about Deneb again now, we pretty much believe it's between 1,500 and 2,500 light years away. We at least have it down to that margin of error, which is like an 80% margin of error. But nonetheless, it's a little bit far away. The fact that that thing is able to measurably hit the Earth with cosmic rays, how many of those are hitting the sun? How influential is that in the sun's behavior? We're trying to figure out on our channel, but we haven't correlated anything yet. But we'll keep you posted.
Yeah, and imagine the current flow on that one decreases as well. What other effects would that have if it
Oh yeah.
decreases its current inflow? Can you imagine that massive thing having a current inflow difference on it, what it would do to everything else?
Well, the good news about that is, David, is that it does have a constant. It has a constant fluctuation because the massive object that's firing the jet right at Earth is, people call it a neutron star. I'll just say a massive radio source. That thing is orbiting its host star at only 4.83 hours per rotation. This thing is going around this host star, which is like the size of Jupiter's orbit, in only 4.83 hours. So, like, imagine what the tidal forces would be like.
Oh, jeez. You get ripped to shreds. Your
Yeah,
your
it's
body.
crazy. And
The velocity of that.
the jet coming out of that thing stretches over 1,000 light years across the Milky Way galaxy and hits you with physical objects. It's crazy. Like, I can't stress it enough that, like, so if there's one object that does that, and there's billions of stars just in our galaxy, and there's billions of galaxies, one of those which is a stronger radio source than the core of our own galaxy due to dust blocking Sagittarius A star from our line of sight. How does that figure into things? Is it possible that Earth is the only place in the universe that has life on it? You can't rule out the possibility. It could be a unique place where it's a nexus of all these cosmic rays hitting. And of course, we're getting into some serious conjecture here, but we don't see anybody else out there. It's pretty weird. Cygnus X3 is a creepy thing. My girlfriend and I talk about it all the time. Like, man, did you see Cygnus X3 picked up in activity? Man, that thing's creepy. Is it going to become our North Star again, like in a sudden cataclysm? I kind of hope not, because I don't want to see that happen.
Is that Charles Hapgood's crustal displacement theory that the Earth shifts on its crust due to that liquid magma and everything shifts? I don't know, was it 21 degrees, something like this?
Yeah,
An
well, yeah,
instant shift.
there are a bunch of different ones, and it's all got to do with pole flips. Keep in mind, when the sun's field aligned currents get to the Earth's magnetosphere, they split into what's called current aligned sheets. So, it gets to the magnetosphere, and part of the charge wants to go to the one pole, and part of the charge wants to go to the other pole. This is part of the reason why a negative BZ in that top pane of the solar wind panel we look at every day, that's part of the reason why a negative BZ, meaning a lot of the energy is coming out of the south solar pole, is associated with earthquakes, because that pushes against the Earth instead of getting pulled into the Earth. So all that stuff changes if the pole flips. That stuff's all backwards now, and we have no idea what that would do. There's also a lot of conjecture coming out now too that the precessional cycle isn't true. The 24,000 and whatever year precessional cycle where the Earth's axis wobbles.
Mm-hmm.
Well, part of these new catastrophe cycle theories are that that's not a thing. That happens in a matter of a very short period of time, and then like goes back slow the other way or violently switches through both. That's why I'm talking about Deneb becoming the North Star again, because maybe it's not a coincidence that Deneb just happens to point right at the Earth's North Pole.
That is a deep statement to leave on here. No, Daniel, go ahead and tell us a little more how we can find you. I know there's a lot of people interested now in hearing more what you have to say. smAsho
right.
Mash on YouTube. Where else can we reach you on the social media, or how can we find website, any kind of way to contact, anything that you could give out for listeners to be able to more easily find your information?
Well, we do have a Facebook page, facebook.com/smAshomash. We got a Minds page, minds.com/smAshomash. We actually have less subscribers there than we do on YouTube, but we got about I think we're up to about 425,000 views on there. So there's some success coming out of there. Also, we accept donations on PayPal, paypal.me/smAsho. We have a Patreon account, patreon.com/smAsho. There's an Instagram page that's a little more personal, a little bit less sciencey stuff on there, but still, the occasional videos of Venus and things like that. So yeah, that's pretty much it. Mainly the YouTube videos, because it's very time consuming, and we're trying to kind of increase the production value and everything one step at a time, so we don't do too much. But trying to stay super interactive with the people who are commenting, answering everybody's questions as much as possible. And yeah, going forward, looking at every possible detail. Occasionally we'll add a section to, like, a month ago, somebody asked us to start covering volcanoes, so we do a volcano rundown every day because it is related after all. So yeah, and we'd like to thank you especially because you've probably done more than anybody else to increase our subscribership. So we really appreciate that, David, and we're referring people to you regularly as well, as you are one of our officially endorsed channels, of course.
Well, it's all about sharing the information. We're all in this together. And as I've said, there's nowhere to run. When the more information we share, the more we can prepare for this together and find solutions. So, this whole world paradigm of, protect what you got, don't let anybody in, keep it, everybody's going to steal from you. You got to completely rethink everything. Now it's a sharing economy where this type of information is the true value moving forward, because these changes can onset rapidly. You talked about the glaciation onsets. There is so much peer-reviewed research out there saying that a full-on glaciation cycle can onset in less than 10 years. I mean, imagine how quickly some of these other solar phenomenon can onset here as well, because we're in new territory with the sun in terms of where it's going, the magnetic field's moving. It didn't do that in the Maunder minimum. So we're in a whole new set of variables this time too. So these onsets could be instant or, extremely rapid in terms of months or years. Not hundreds and years and centuries, like millennia, like they teach us in the books.
As we say on our channel nearly every day, when we look at that Gong 2 data, the magnetic environment can change with absolutely zero warning. So there's not a lot of predictive value in it. You got to look at all these other variables to try to figure out what it's going to do magnetically. And while you're able to predict it sometimes, other times, a reverse polarity sunspot comes out of nowhere and you weren't expecting it. So. But, at least if a nova happens and you watch our channel every day, you may have a few extra hours to prepare for it.
That would be nice. I could use every second I could get if that event happens.
And also look on the bright side. We're on opposite sides of the planet. So if the planet stops rotating, one of us will probably survive.
That is true. And again, come back to these extinction level events where there's larger animals on the planet. Something happened to wipe out the larger animals across North America. It's the same thing. When these planetary events happen, one side of the planet seems to get the brunt of the punishment, if you will, and the other side seems to carry on the civilization or the flora or the fauna of the world, and then it repopulates everything.
Yeah,
nothing ever goes to zero. We're not into an extinction event where all humans are going to disappear, but billions will. That's a discussion for another day, but that's why we're bringing the channel. And that does take a lot of time to do all these videos. When you hit that on the head, it is time consuming. We're saving you time and presenting information you would never be able to source yourself. That in itself is true value.
I love the
time and the sourcing of the info to compile it for those viewers and listeners out there.
I love the long form conversation, by the way, too. It allows everybody to, not be taken out of context, not be trying to say sound bites, not worried about compactness. I tend to talk fast on my morning videos because there's a lot of data shoved in there.
Certainly is. Data feed with groovy tunes. If that's the style you like, then smAsho Mash channel is for you.
Thanks, man. I guess I got to upload some more. I got hundreds of tracks in here, so gotta start marketing those a little more too. Put them on SoundCloud, and you can check out soundclick.com/goldencatproductions. You can stream or download tracks there also if you like.
Oh, good one. Because the YouTube sound library is limited at times, so anything else that's out there. And as well on my channel, I have the Grand Solar Minimum Resources page on oilseedcrops.org, and I'm just reworking the website. So it's stripped down to bare basics. I was going to strip it down and then bring it back up again. But at the moment, there's about 100 links inside the Grand Solar Minimum resource page that can get you out to some of these same feeds that Daniel's looking at, as well as others that I haven't included that he has on there with the solar wind polarity, etc. So,
excellent.
Yeah, I've been talking with Dan Nigro from smAsho Mash. I'm David Dubyne, your host from Adapt 2030. We're going to sign off right now, but Dan, any last words before we go?
No, man. Thanks for having me. Onward and upward, and stay in touch. Don't be a stranger.
We'll get this out in just a couple hours for the viewers, and hope everybody took this information to heart and you do your own research.
Sounds good. Best wishes, big guy.
All right, bye.
See ya.